Okay, the second exam is now open, and I wanted to do a little review, just a reminder of stuff that we've covered already. The exam will be over chapters 2 through 4 in human biology. It'll be a little bit longer than the first exam because it covers more, so it's around 40 questions, including 2 essays where I'd like you to write a paragraph or two on a question. You'll have 60 minutes and just one attempt to do the exam. So, when you're studying for this, it's really important to look over the words in bold in those chapters, the key words that are listed in the PowerPoints. Also, it's really nice to look over chapter summaries, the Moodle quizzes, and then just to review the major topics. Chapters 2 through 4 go over things all the way from chemistry, cells, tissues, and our first introduction to organs. And so this is looking at human biology kind of from the lens of going from the smaller to the larger. So we started with chemistry, and so there were just some basic ideas about atomic structure, that atoms are composed of neutrons and protons in the center of the atom, and that they're surrounded by electrons that are orbiting the nucleus of the atom. Okay, different types of atoms have different numbers of protons, and then the number of protons determines the positive charge of the nucleus, and that's usually in an uncharged atom balanced by the number of electrons. The number of electrons can vary, though. Although the number of protons is never going to change in an atom, electrons can be gained or lost or shared. And so sometimes atoms will take on a charge in order to get a more stable arrangement of electrons. And so, like here, this shows sodium and chlorine, that those atoms gain and lose electrons, lose and gain electrons respectively, so that they get a stable arrangement. And this is what forms an ionic bond. And so in atoms that have done this, they often become associated, and then they have new properties. And so while sodium is a metal and chlorine is a poisonous gas, when they combine in this situation here, they form table salt. And so a good example of that. Other types of atoms will share electrons, and these are called covalent bonds. And electrons that are shared this way will orbit the center of both atoms, and then will hold those atoms together fairly tightly. A good example of this kind of activity is water. A water molecule contains 1 oxygen and 2 hydrogen atoms, and the hydrogen and oxygen are each sharing a pair of electrons, and so they're held tightly together. In this case, the electrons aren't shared equally, and so there are partially positive and partially negative regions of these molecules that allow them to interact with one another by forming hydrogen bonds. Okay, and then we also talked in this chapter about organic molecules. These are things that are large molecules that contain carbon and hydrogen bonds. They are complex and form, although water is by far the most abundant material in the human body, these molecules are important structurally. Carbohydrates, shown here, like glucose and fructose, these contain lots of carbon, but a lot of water as well. That's why they're carbohydrates. So they contain also oxygen and hydrogen. And so these include sugars, starches, things like that. Another organic molecule are fatty acids. They contain mostly carbon-hydrogen bonds, and they are very nonpolar, so they're oily. Third type of organic molecule are proteins. These are made of amino acids that contain nitrogen units in these amine groups, and then on the other end of amino acid you had a carboxyl group, and these things can join, and a protein is just a chain of amino acids, and these fold up into very complex structures, so are very useful. And then the last type of organic molecules are nucleic acids. Okay, these also contain nitrogen, but in a different form and bases, and it's basically a code for making proteins. Okay, all right. So cells are the most important functional units of the living body. They're the smallest living part um, of a life. We're going to look at lots of organelles, but the most important ones are like the plasma membrane, the nucleus, maybe the ribosomes, and mitochondria. So here's the cells of a fertilized egg being taken apart. Here's a diagram showing the nucleus, the cell membrane, and then these colored organelles. The boundary of the cell is the plasma membrane, which controls what goes in and out of cells, and so contains some protein channels or pores. Okay, and this allows specific molecules to enter. They've got to have the right shape and charge to fit that pore. Also, in the nucleus here, that's where the nucleic acid, the DNA, is. And these are pieces of DNA that can be made into proteins. And so the ribosomes are going to help do that, and the proteins then can do lots of different functions. Okay, so that's chapter 2, 3, and now chapter 4 talks about tissues. These are just groups of similar cells that work together. Often they're found in layers. There are 4 basic types. So I have here the Fantastic Four. Tissues include epithelial, connective, muscle, and nerve tissue. And these tissues, some contract, some form structures, some line body surfaces. Okay, tissues, these multiple tissues working together make up organs. And the simplest organs are just made up of 2 tissues, 2 layers, like an epithelial tissue and a connective tissue. Here's a mucous membrane. You can see some of these goblet cells here making mucus. That's the upper layer. The lower layer is just underneath that, looks distinctly different. Okay, and this is where we introduced our first organ system, which is the skin, which is a membrane. The upper layer of the skin is an epithelial tissue, which we call the epidermis. The lower layer of the skin, the dermis, contains connective tissue. And these are found together, and they function to do lots of things like protect the body, regulate temperature, make vitamin D. We have sensory receptors in the skin. We use the skin to communicate by lots of things like that. A really important part of this chapter is where we introduce the idea of homeostasis. The maintaining of a stable, not constant, just stable, small fluctuations for an internal environment. The system that does these are usually negative feedback systems, and they oppose change, so they maintain that, hold that stability. As I mentioned, the skin is important in homeostasis. It has a big role in heat loss, and we determine the amount of heat loss by controlling the blood flow to our skin and the production of perspiration. And that evaporation can cause that. The skin also has a role in producing vitamin D, which is needed for calcium homeostasis and other things. Okay, and then the last thing we mentioned here was skin color. Skin produces a pigment called melanin, and specific cells do this, and then they send the pigment throughout the skin, and this protects us from damage by sunlight. And areas where there's higher sunlight, people have generally have evolved to have darker skin. Okay, so reminder, the exam is open, will be open through Sunday. Take a look at the chapters, go through that, and then take the exam. Good luck.